I've learned a long time ago when you have two sons, you can never say you have a favorite son. You can say, I have no better son than, in this case, Weston or Burke. And after reading these papers, I think I'm going to make the same compliment. I can't say we got the best papers, but I will say there are no better papers in the conference than these. So I think that's my attempt at a very subtle backhanded compliment. I'm assuming everyone in the room has read these papers. And what's exciting for me, I've been a practitioner for over 30 years in municipal finance, and to actually look at theory being academic theory and being applied to the marketplace. We just had a very interesting conversation in front of the orange juice container with Alex on his, but to actually look at that and see how it applies is just really fascinating. I couldn't be more excited for these three papers. What we will do is Alex will speak first, then we will have, I learned a new word, probably should have known it I play words with friends a lot, discussant. But so then we'll have discussant come up, and then the next paper will be Peter's discussant, and then finally we'll have the third paper. So what I'd like to do is introduce Alex, and just not that I don't want to compliment the other papers, but we were talking about the research he did, and I've been very involved in bond pricing for 30 years, and the amount of research and analytics he had to do was just incredible. So I compliment him on that, and it's a very exciting result. Alex?
Thank you for being here. It's an honor to be here and talk briefly about some of my ongoing research. There is an ongoing debate about term limit, and the natural question that you may ask is, why should term limit be a concern to you? I mean, as a municipal finance professional. The interesting thing is, this presentation will give you the answer. So what are term limits? Term limits actually constrains the number of terms state governors can serve in office. And of course, US states vary in whether they hold elected officials to, this term limit. So in our sample, we have 10 states that had no term limit and 29 states that had some form of term limit. And 11 states changed their term limit that is within our sample period. So for instance, Massachusetts had term limit and got it changed. Massachusetts had no term limit and got it changed to having term limit and got that repealed by the state Supreme Court. Legislative term limits, likewise, constrains the number of terms state legislators are allowed to serve in office. And as of 2010, we had about 15 states with this kind of term limit. The questions we want to always seek to answer in this paper is, what is the impact of the last term of the governor when the term limit is binding or bind? Does the last term of the governor has any impact on municipal bond yields? And does the term limit itself has any impact on bond yields? And does the legislative term limit have any impact on bond yields? So these are three natural questions we seek to answer in this paper. Well, I want to briefly talk about what has been done on term limits. Basically, in case, use a model that has imperfect information where voters and the incumbent governors they behave rationally. And they use this model to determine the impact of term limits on state economic policy choices. And what did they find? They find in the data that governors in their first term spend reasonably, and they do so to build political capital in order to be re-elected for a second term. However, in the last term of the governor, when the term limit is binding, they find different results. What do they find? They find higher spending. That is in the last term when the term limit bind. So what is the implication of their findings? They conclude that these reduced spending in the first term of the governor and the increased spending in the last term of the governor actually lead to a greater fiscal volatility in states where there are term limits. And Crane and Tollison, do find similar results. So what do we seek to do here? Well, intuitively, what we are arguing, or our story, is that this greater fiscal volatility in states with term limits actually increases the risk of municipal borrowing, and therefore we should expect higher yields in bonds issued from states that have these gubernatorial term limits. So our sample is from SDC Platinum. That is the global public finance, and the sample period is from 1990 to 2010. You look on the board, we have the initial sample is over 300,000. When we merged it with the state level data, we had it reduced to about 255 or so thousand. However, some of these bonds or bond issues do have missing values such as the yields, whether the bond is rated or not rated. So we drop these and we end up with a final sample of about 100,000. And we have to remember, I have to say this, that these bond issues actually consist of issues that, like trenches. So we have the trenches being weighted by the total, by the proceeds of each trench. And therefore, we end up with the 100,000 sample size. We convert S&P letter rating to numeric rating. So for instance, S&P rating of AAA is 1. S&P rating of AA plus is 2, and so on and so forth. And we control for state level characteristics such as the economic conditions in the state demographic factors that could potentially have impact on the yield, and we control for the treasury rate and so on and so forth. So you look at the statistics, we have the average or the mean proceed is about 36 million. And of course, we have to realize that these bond issues also include bond issued by villages, towns, school districts, and so on and so forth. So these are not only state-issued bonds. So the average sample size, of course, will be smaller. So it's about 36. Maturity is about 18 years. Bond rating, average bond rating is about 2.3, which is between S&P rating of AA plus and AA. We have about 60% of the bond issues are associated with some form of credit enhancement. And gold bond is about 62%. So what is the empirical framework here? Well, so this is the empirical framework. This is the econometric method approach we use for our analysis. The P represent the key or the main predictors of interest, and that is the last term of the governor, the gubernatorial term limit, and the legislative term limits, because these are the variables of interest. T represent, bond characteristics, such as whether the bond is a gold bond issued through negotiation or negotiated deals, whether the bond is callable, and so on and so forth. Z is state macro, so we have the states we account for, we control for the revenue of the state, the expenditure. We control for the demographic variables of the state. Then we have state fixed effect, which takes care of the economic conditions in the state. And we also control for the year fixed effect. And so these are the controls we have in our model. So these are the controls. And of course, there are a lot. And well, with time, I can't explain why we control for all these, especially with the state level characteristics, but they are important to be controlled for. For instance, we expect as municipal finance practitioners, we expect that larger states, have broader revenue base. So we control for the population size. We control for unemployment rate. So, these controls are important factors that could potentially drive the yield. We have endogeneity concern for the research. And this concern is important in the sense that one may argue that these term limits were put in place at a time where the states, or at the time where states were facing economic problems. So we had poor economic conditions, and therefore they put these term limits in place. That is, a strong argument. So how do we control for this? How do we ensure that the result, the effect of the last term of the governor and those term limits on bond yields are actually not being driven by poor economic conditions in the state? We follow what has been done in the literature by Besley and Case, and we have different samples. One sample is we look at bonds issued from states that had gubernatorial term limit throughout our sample period. So in this sample, the concern of endogeneity is unlikely. Second sample is we look at bonds from states that had no change in gubernatorial term limit. So for instance, you have Vermont and New York, which did not change from not having term limit to term limits in our sampling period. And we also had in this second sample, bonds issued from states that actually had term limit throughout. So meaning we include the first sample in the second sample as well. The third sample, we have bonds issued from states that actually change their term limit status. So Massachusetts changed from not having term limit to term limit and got it repealed. It's in this sample. So bonds from these states are in this sample. Then the fourth sample is the big sample, which has about 100,000 observations. So what do we find? We find that consistently, the governor last term is significant, statistically and economically. So for instance, in the first model, bonds issued in the last term of the governor, when term limits are binding, have about 3.4 basis points higher in yield. And this is consistent across the different samples. Well, one also may argue that bonds issued in the last term of the governor may have different characteristics. You may have more negotiated bonds, more revenue bonds, or more gold bonds, and so on and so forth. So we want to rule out the effect of these bond characteristics, or we want to examine whether the characteristics of the bond issued in the last term of the governor, have any impact on the yield. So we do univariate analysis, and we find that negotiated deals are higher in the last term of the governor. And in fact, negotiated deals do have higher yield in the last term of the governor. We also find similar results, that revenue bonds issued in the last term of the governor are associated with higher yield. So with that said, we now want to look at the gubernatorial term limit itself. Does it have effect on bond yield? And of course, we do find that gubernatorial term limits have significant and economic effect on bond yields. That is, bonds issued from states that have gubernatorial term limits are associated with higher yield. Now we look at an interesting, in my opinion, this is one of the key punchlines, and we never thought about this, and my co-author brought it up that we look into this. Well, we argued earlier that the last term of the governor, when term limits bind, have positive effect on bond yields. Well, what about those governors serving in their last term that have continued political ambitions? So in the last term of the governor, the governor does not have any incentives to behave as if he was serving in the first term. Well, you may have a governor like my governor in New Jersey, Chris, whatever the last name is, who attempted to run for higher office. So intuitively, we anticipate that this governor is not going to be, this governor will behave in the second term as if he was still serving in his first term to build political capital in order to, win any higher elected elections beyond the governorship. So we examine this and we find that, in fact, governors that have higher political ambitions post-governorship do have negative effect on bond yields. And that is really interesting because they still want to behave in a consistent manner to build political capital. They want to behave, that is just the intuition. They want to be fiscally conservative. And we have another measure, which is post-governor plus. Post-governor plus actually includes, remember, the post-governor includes only governors that actually did run for elected office while serving in the last term. Post-governor plus includes these governors as well as the governors serving the last term where gubernatorial term limit was binding but did not run for a higher elected office. However, these governors got appointed by the president to serve in the cabinet or appointed to serve as an ambassador. So we have these in the post-governor plus measure. And we see significant impact that they have higher negative impact on bond yield. The next thing we look at is the legislative term limit. And the argument that has been documented in the literature that legislative term limits actually have significant effect on the turnover of state legislators. And as a result, it leads to loss of experience and polity expertise. And it's also been found that it has states with this term limits have higher state spending. So we examine this and we find that, yes, legislative term limits also have a higher impact on yields. The last thing we look at is the political affiliation. So we've done all these things. One may argue that, well, the political affiliation or the political structure in the state should have something to do with the yields or be driving the yields, because that is what's been found by Besley and Case, that actually states with term limits are significantly more likely to be governed by Democrats. And states that have higher spending in the last term of the governor are, in fact, blue states. So it is possible for someone to argue that the political structure in the state could be driving this result. So we do that, and we find that, no, there's no political affiliation in the yield. So the results are not being driven by political affiliation. So this, I'm done with time, right? Okay, so that is the conclusion, and thank you so much.
No one knows how nerve-wracking it is. We have a countdown clock here, and it was like the strong finish. Like, oh, you're going to miss it by about 2 seconds. So, Alex, that was great. That's the good news. The bad news is I think you do have a true industry expert who's going to be the discussant, John Halsey, who is one of the icons in the industry. So have a seat, and maybe this is going to be like your PhD dissertation. So good luck. Good luck, John. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I think Dan said in the first session he was proud to be an American. No, I'm not running for office, okay? Don't get nervous. But it just boggles the mind to me that a young scholar from Ghana would come to the United States to study and explain to us what term limits are all about. Isn't that amazing? I mean, I think it's extraordinary. But in his 49-page paper here, the summary tables of the statistics are 14 pages of it. So what Brad was mentioning early is absolutely true. Tremendous amount of spreadsheets went into this work. But what's interesting to me now is I'll give you a little take as the, crusty old practitioner. The paper really challenges the conventional wisdom regarding term limits. I mean, I think when the groundswell of term limits came up, the thought was, well, we've got to deconcentrate the power a little bit. And perhaps if we shake it up, there'll be a little more accountability and there won't be as much spending. And Robert Doty was talking about California. I always go back to California a little bit too, because at times of crisis, they are instructive on point. I mean, I see term limits and I always think Willie Brown. And Willie Brown was pretty much ruling the legislature in those days. He eventually went on to become mayor of San Francisco. But he had so much power, I think that is part of the reason term limits were adopted in California. I mean, you couldn't make a budget deal without going to Willie in those days. And if Willie didn't like it, it didn't go through. So I think the thought was, well, you got to shake it up and see if you get some new blood into the legislature to make a change. But again, the basic premise of the paper is that term limits increase the cost of muni borrowing. Now, albeit, I will say, he's gone to great lengths to control for other variables. And I respect what he's tried to do there. I think it's kind of tough to really separate out all of those variables. The hardest one I have is political party is not a strong predictor. Again, in my experience, red state, blue state, you really have different philosophies about, budgeting, debt, and a lot of these fundamental principles. And although it gets muddied because, it's a bicameral legislature, there still are somewhat predictive in terms of what party's ruling. But the best I really appreciate, having worked with the dark arts in my former life as an investment banker and a sell-side person, where he boils it all down and says term limits versus no term limits increases interest costs by 12.87 basis points. 12.87 basis points. Remarkable. When you work on a trading floor, and I know some of you do, you go to the underwriter and you say, well, there's this particular credit development and this is what's happening and it's somewhat negative. And pretty much the standard answer you always get back, oh, that's worth about 5 to 10 basis points, And maybe in this market where spreads have really contracted and rates are ridiculously low, I know Ben loves that, but they are really low. Maybe that's contracted to maybe 3 to 5 instead of 5 to 10. But it's still meaningful when you're talking about billions of bonds being underwritten every month. So I thought that was interesting. He also said that the differential increases to 16.37 basis points when a governor is in his or her last term. Again, pretty interesting. And whether or not you're running for higher office, also very, very interesting. I mean, I think that for those of us who have been bankers, we fully realize and appreciate that a governor in his or her last term, likes to dole out certain projects, to the loyal underwriting team before they vacate office. And, frequently those, and he notes this in his work, that the deals are much larger in the last term. And they wind up costing a little bit more, but one of the interesting things is a lot of times those projects that are doled out in the last term happen to be revenue bonds, and they frequently happen to be transportation projects. And we know when they come, they're of pretty great size and incorporate a lot. In the study, the sample was 62.5% GO, and 57.1% negotiated. So it's kind of heavily weighted towards GO, as he said. He went back to 1990. I come away wondering, there's always the discussion about, you know, the competitive market is the purest market in terms of just, you know, bid ask and pure competition. I wonder what the data would look like if you only use competitive underwriting. Would it look much different or not? Hard to say, because SIFMA for years has been trying to do studies, you know, negotiated underwriting costs more than competitive underwriting. And of course, nobody's ever been able to prove it completely definitively. But intuitively, we kind of think, well, you know, that's probably true to a certain extent, because a lot of times the people go the negotiated route because the deals are more complex. And they want to use more products, and they want to, you know, appeal to a lot of different buyers. So a lot of times negotiated is a more expensive way to go. But clearly, nothing's really out of line in this market in terms of costs. Everybody has to be pretty tight on what they're doing. The good part of the study, too, is also that he excludes Puerto Rico and the territories and some of the outliers, which really would have affected the numbers quite a bit. So I thought that was a good thing. And of course, because I work for a guarantor, he makes the statement that term limits also contribute to the greater utilization of credit enhancement. Now, this was pretty interesting to me. And that the credit enhancement saves approximately 10.5 bips. When a last term is introduced in the mix, that benefit increases to 13.5 basis points. I thought that was pretty interesting. I'm sure our leadership would be greatly appreciative of what you're saying there. He does also make the statement that education bonds are riskier because they're more under the control of legislators who frequently exhibit less fiscal discipline. Well, I agree with the less fiscal discipline part, but I really don't think that that happens with education bonds. I also think that, you know, this whole notion of seeking higher offices or more fiscal discipline, I think inherently that kind of makes sense, but, you know, I'm still a little skeptical on that point. I think I'm doing okay on time here, but the other aspect of all this is, you know, it's hard to control for specialty states and what effect that has on yields, and I'm not sure that that was fully baked in the mix. So what are we supposed to do with all this information? The authors really don't take a stand on what we're supposed to do with the information. There is no call for repeal of term limits. I mean, I guess one could infer that term limits should be banned or nullified. But it is interesting that the thrust of the paper makes the point that the political structures alone strongly contribute to the financial outcome. And taking it to its logical conclusion, this paper certainly could be used in support of ceasing term limits. But I'm sure the legislatures who have them and the governors who have them, I don't know that they'd be completely receptive to it. They'd hear you and say, thank you very much, and life goes on. But, you know, I do think the work was very methodical and thorough. And, you know, ultimately it comes back to what is the market going to do with it? Thank you.
Alex, if you're wondering how you did, I know John. I think you can call the family back in Ghana and said you've done really well on your presentation. Yeah, there was, a couple things that weren't 100% positive, but coming from John Halsey, that's an incredible compliment in terms of the quality of your paper, and he certainly echoes my sentiments. Our next one is, I think they're all great, but I think Peter did some really exciting work.
Thank you so much.
Oh, we're doing Q&A. Yeah. Sorry, Peter. Yeah, I made you all nervous for a second. Let's see, I won't make that mistake. I got 2 more times to do it. I won't make that the next time. But let's have some questions. If you don't have any questions, I certainly have questions. But are there any questions out there? Here's one right here.
Hi, I'm Louise Shaner from the Hutchins Center here at Brookings. So I have a question sort of on the theory, which is what I would have guessed would be the opposite, which is that the stories you hear is that you would have something like term limits because you wanted to prevent elected officials from giving away goodies right in front of an election. That they would like to do the right thing, which is to look not just at current taxpayers, but current and future taxpayers, but because they want to get reelected, they would actually increase spending. So I was just sort of surprised at like the theory that would say that electability makes you be fiscally responsible as opposed to fiscally irresponsible.
Okay, thanks for the question. I guess initially we had the same intuition. However, when I read the paper by Besley and Case, which is a well-documented paper, their argument that the reduced spending in the first term of the governor and the increased spending in the last term of the governor when gubernatorial term limits bind actually leads to the greater fiscal volatility in those states, kind of made us to go back and rethink that, well, if there is this, uncertainty, then this uncertainty in the states that have the term limit, should lead to increase in the risk of municipal bonds, and that should reflect on higher yields. So it's a kind of counterintuitive, but our story for this paper is largely based on the model of Besley and Case, which talked about that. Mm-hmm. So on that basis, yes, our argument holds in that sense.
Yeah, I think too, we kind of, for some of us practitioners, we see the world through the debt prism, and debt is kind of related to but separate from fiscal discipline, So where do the two intersect? It's kind of interesting, but I think what that statement is really driving at is, there's a little bit more budgetary discipline versus just incurring more debt.
Next question right over here in the corner.
Hi, Tracy Gordon from the Urban Institute. So I think it's a really interesting question, and in this literature on fiscal institutions, the problem is always that the institutions don't change very frequently. So you've got these states that have looked a certain way for a long time, and you don't know how much of what you're seeing is due to the state being itself versus the institution that you're trying to study, right? So you exploit these places where there was a change and they changed their policy towards term limits. But I just wonder if you looked at particular states and why they adopted term limits, right? Because you might be concerned that the reason that they adopted the limit is also the thing that's affecting yields. So I think the paper would really, and I apologize, I have not read the paper, but it would really benefit from having a couple of stories about places that adopted term limits, what led to that policy change, and thinking about if there's something else that perhaps you could use that's, in sort of technical terms, an exclusion restriction that would predict the adoption of the term limits, but not the outcome that you're looking at, the yields.
Okay, thank you. That is obviously a good question, and that has to do with the endogeneity problem, that identification problem. So the argument is you don't know for sure whether the term limits were adopted by states with certain kind of economic problems. So earlier on in the presentation, I kind of addressed this concern that, well, we looked at bonds issued from states that have gubernatorial term limit throughout the sample period, throughout the 20s, 1990 to 2010. So these states have gubernatorial term limit. They did not change. They have the term limit. And therefore, the effect of the the governor last term is not driven by any economic conditions prevailing in those states. We also looked at bonds issued from states that actually had a term limit changed. And we found similar results. And we looked at states, then we looked at the overall sample size, the overall thing. So it includes every state, whether the state had term limit or did not have term limit. So yes, that concern is addressed in the paper, and I talked about it.
Yeah, one tangential topic was, he did mention in the paper states with the initiative process. And of course, the history on that goes back a little longer, but he also made the statement that initiatives, states with, generally drive up yields. So I think that would be kind of an interesting sideline to see if we could get some history on that and see if that explains it a little more.
All right, time for one more question right here.
Andy Glassberg, camp to Portland, Maine. I got a couple of questions building on what you talked about, but perhaps a bit expanding on it. You look primarily or maybe exclusively at local sub-state borrowing. I think one would expect that state rules would have a bigger effect, whatever it might be, on state borrowing or statewide institutional borrowing. So, first question would be about that. Secondly, you look at both gubernatorial term limits and legislative term limits. And I think my hypothesis would be that legislative term limits might make more of a difference because institutional memory is a bigger issue at the legislative level, perhaps, than it would be at the state level. Let me just ask for your, or perhaps both of your responses to those two issues.
Well, no, that's fine. Well, your point about institutional memory is well taken. I mean, you know, part of the reason Jerry Brown's been such an effective governor this go-around is he was governor before, and he knows the legislature pretty well. And that was the argument when Willie Brown was in. Well, you have this guy who's so experienced and knows how to bring the different parties together to talk. Why change it? But I think people valued the fact that it was more important to shake it up and make a change than tend to keep with the institutional memory. But you know, maybe that's part of the problem Illinois is having. I mean, I don't know, but well, they don't have term limits, I don't think. But the point is, when you have a lot of turnover, you do have legislators who have to learn on the job, and it makes it a little tougher to come to a budget reconciliation. There's no doubt about that in my mind. So you give something up.
Thank you. Well, so let me understand the state rules. So the variation in state, state rules across states. That is why we control for the state fixed effect. So we understood that there may be unobservable state characteristics that, might impact bond yield or could potentially drive the effect of the governor last term and those gubernatorial term limits. And that is why we put in the state fixed effect to control for possible variation in state rules. So that takes care of that.
Thank you. I guess I'm allowed to ask a question. It's for Alex. Don't take your mic off yet. And when we were talking, I don't know if it's a conference call or out here, you mentioned that you may return to Ghana and assist them with what we would call public finance here. So my question to you is, if you had input, would you have term limits in Ghana?
There are term limits in Ghana. Because
so would you encourage? Would you encourage that they stay in place?
Well, I'm kind of indifferent. Good. I'm kind of indifferent. Okay. And we went into this with indifferent mind.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, at breakfast this morning, he first mentioned to me that he was drawn to this topic because he was first thinking about the effect of corruption
interesting.
On bond prices and yields. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
That was outstanding.